Welcome to this lesson on laws and policies during Reconstruction. Remember, there are no more slaves. They were freed during the Civil War. So now the United States has the problem of what to do with these newly freed men who have no education, no money, no job, and own no land or farming equipment. So let's take a trip back through history and see what we can learn. If you look at the photo on this first slide, you can see the ruins of Richmond from April 1865. The Civil War is over, and much of the South is devastated and looks exactly like this. The Southerners need to rebuild, and they also need to repair their economy, their way of life, and the way they make a living. So their first step is going to be who's going to do the work, since all of their slaves are free. America has a long to-do list. First of all, freed slaves in the South needed jobs, food, and shelter after the war. The federal government needed to stop Southern states from passing the laws that restricted newly freed African Americans' rights. The federal government said that we could use military force if necessary. The U.S. needs to figure out how to allow African Americans the right to vote. And we need to solve the problem of some Northerners moving to the South and taking advantage of the post-war devastation, like you see here in Richmond, Virginia. All of these things become the responsibility of the federal government. If you remember, the federal government is stationed in Washington, D.C., and is in charge of overseeing the entire country. Individual state governments have rights as well to create laws, and we are going to see during Reconstruction that there is a lot of conflict between the federal government laws and the laws set by states in the South concerning these newly freed African Americans. Let's see how well America does on her to-do list. One of the first creations of the federal government in Washington, D.C., under Abraham Lincoln is the Freedmen's Bureau. So freedman meaning the newly freed African Americans. And this was established to aid means to help, former African Americans that were slaves in the South by educating them and finding them jobs. Most slaves could not read or write, and once they were set free from the plantations they worked on, they no longer had jobs. The Freedmen's Bureau also worked hard in settling disputes or fights between blacks and whites. Because oftentimes if they went to court or the police station, people in those positions were primarily white, and so the African Americans had a disadvantage. The Freedmen's Bureau tried to aid these people. At the end of the Civil War, all the slaves were declared free. However, most Southern states decided that they needed to restrict the rights of these newly free African Americans, and they would see exactly how far they could go before the federal government would step in and tell the states that these laws were not okay. The first set of laws states in the South tried to pass were called Black Codes, and these were laws passed by Southern states to restrict the rights of African Americans. These rights were different based on what state you were in, and most of the time it restricted where they were allowed to move, where they were allowed to go in the city, if they were allowed to vote or not, where they were allowed to shop. But the biggest one of these laws was state by state that the new freedmen could not vote in elections. So the federal government stepped in and said to each state, you may not have these black codes. These are suppressing African Americans' equal rights. They are equal to the white man. So African Americans then gained some equal rights as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which authorized the use of federal troops for reinforcement. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 says that the United States government can send Army troops, those same troops that just fought the Civil War, down to the South to make sure that people in the Southern states are doing what they're supposed to be doing. The Civil Rights Act says a very similar thing as the 14th Amendment, which you learned about before. So now a lot of these Northern soldiers who had just gone home from fighting in the Civil War are sent back down to supervise the South to make sure that Southern leaders are following the rules. The first rule is that African Americans are allowed to vote. It says this in the 15th Amendment. Many state leaders forbid African Americans from voting, and so as a result, the Northern soldiers would come down to the South and protect these newly freed men as they went to vote in elections. Many African American leaders were elected in the South during Reconstruction. However, former Confederate leaders are not allowed to vote. So if you were high up in the Confederate government during the Civil War or a military leader during the Civil War, you are no longer allowed to vote in elections. So those rights were taken away from you, but you are allowed to still live in the United States. Not all Northerners did the right thing, and not all Southerners did the wrong thing. There were many Northerners who took advantage of the South during this time period. You saw how devastated Richmond was in the first picture of this presentation. And many men called carpetbaggers because they carried suitcases made of carpet. That's what it was made of during the time period. And you can see those bags pictured here, these carpetbaggers. They took advantage of this situation. They would come in and start businesses and run for office in the South. And these men really just wanted to make money off of a bad situation. And they were nicknamed carpetbaggers because of the bags that they carried. As you can see from these political cartoons pictured here, that these men were not well liked in the South, and the Southerners resented them. They were unhappy about their presence. Reconstruction attempted to give meaning to the freedom that the former slaves had achieved. So once the slaves were free at the end of the Civil War, now the United States has to figure out how these men and women and children could become educated, get jobs, own land. They have to absorb them into the rest of society. And this causes a lot of tension in the South, as you can see from many of the laws and policies that were in place. Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877 as a result of a compromise over the outcome of the election of 1876. Two men ran against each other for president in 1876. One was named Hayes and one was named Tilden. There was a tie in the case of the president. And so what ended up happening was Hayes told Congress that if you make me president, I will end Reconstruction. And he has a couple ideas of how he's going to do this, and they ended up being a success. The first one was that federal troops were removed from the South. So Hayes said, I will get those Northern soldiers out of your hair, Southerners, if you elect me president. Okay, so many of the Northern soldiers packed up these federal troops and went home. And that signified the end of Reconstruction. The South was then left alone. Unfortunately, many of the rights that African Americans had gained during Reconstruction were lost through Jim Crow laws, and we'll talk more about what that means next week. But there were new laws in place. So let's see how America did on her to-do list. Freed slaves in the South needed jobs, food, and shelter after the war, and the Freedmen's Bureau worked very hard to supply these things. America needed to stop Southern states from passing laws that restricted newly freed African American rights, and we did this through the 14th and 15th Amendment, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1876, and the U.S. government sent the military to the South to use force if necessary. African Americans were allowed to vote under the 15th Amendment, and again, the federal troops supported that. We needed to solve the problem of some Northerners moving to the South and taking advantage of the devastation. These men were called carpetbaggers. This problem was not really solved during Reconstruction, and like we said before, rights that African Americans had gained were lost through Jim Crow laws. So if Reconstruction was a success or not is up for you to decide. Please complete your notes and turn them in when you come to class. Have a great night. Please remember to pause, rewind, and rewatch this presentation as many times as you need so that you are familiar with the different laws and policies of Reconstruction.